Montana Territory, July 1872. The sun was setting behind the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long shadows across the alley behind the general store in the town of Bridgers Hollow. That was when she ran, skirts hiked, boots slapping against packed dirt, chest heaving. Blood on her sleeve. Elara Laneson had nowhere left to go. They had followed her from the saloon, the two men. She had seen the way they looked at her when she turned down their offer for a drink. She had seen that kind of look before back in Kansas, before the railroad took her husband and the fever took her little boy. Now they had her cornered between a stack of crates and a locked back door, and there was no wind tonight, just the sound of ragged breathing and bootsteps closing in. She threw a broken bottle at the first one. He ducked. The second stepped forward with a grin and reached for her. Then a voice low and firm cut through the still air. "You're coming with me." The men turned. A tall cowboy stood at the mouth of the alley, shadowed by the dying light. He wore a trail coat and dust from the plains. His hand rested on the butt of the revolver at his hip, but he had not drawn it. He did not need to. Elara stared. She had never seen him before, but there was something in his eyes, something steady, like river rock. The taller of the two men scowled. "This ain't your business, stranger." The cowboy stepped forward. "It is now." The first man lunged. The cowboy moved faster than Elara could follow. A hard punch, a knee to the gut, and the man was on the ground groaning. The second turned to run, but the cowboy caught his shoulder and slammed him into the wall, hard. Then he looked at Elara. "Can you walk?" She nodded, still clutching her injured arm. He offered his hand. "Come on." She took it. They walked down the alley and out into the open street. The town was quiet, oil lamps flickering in windows. He kept her close, eyes scanning for more trouble. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elara Laneson." He nodded. "I'm Jedidiah Zane." A woman passed by with a laundry basket and glanced at them. Elara looked down, suddenly aware of how she must look, blood on her sleeve, hair a mess, hand in a stranger's. Jedidiah led her down the boardwalk and into the livery stable. Inside, it smelled of hay and horses. He guided her to the workbench and grabbed a clean cloth. "Let me see your arm." She hesitated. "It's just a scratch." "Let me see it anyway." She rolled up her sleeve. The cut was shallow but bleeding. He poured water from a canteen and cleaned it gently, then wrapped it with the cloth. His fingers were rough, but his touch was careful. "You always go chasing down trouble like that?" she asked. His eyes met hers. "Only when I see someone who doesn't deserve it." She looked away. "I don't even know why they followed me. They did it because they thought they could. That's all." Jedidiah stood and wiped his hands. "Where are you staying?" "I was renting a room above the tailor's, but I can't go back. They'll be waiting." He hesitated. "Then come with me." Elara blinked. "What?" "I have a cabin up in the hills. It's quiet." "No one will find you there unless I want them to." When she did not answer, he added, "You'll be safe." She looked at him for a moment. There was no pressure in his voice, just calm certainty. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her safety without strings. "All right," she said. They rode out just after dark. Jedidiah's horse, a broad-chested bay, carried them both. Elara sat behind him, her arms around his waist. The stars came out one by one overhead, and the town fell away behind them. It was a long ride into the hills, the trail winding through pine and aspen. Either of them spoke much. But Elara felt the tension leave her chest, bit by bit, with every mile. When they reached the cabin, it was small but clean, with a stone fireplace and a wide porch. Jedidiah lit a lantern and showed her inside. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep out here." "You do not have to, I know," he said, and gave her a tired smile. "But it's better that way." She nodded. He brought her a blanket and stood in the doorway. "You are safe here, Elara." Then he stepped back and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the quiet. Outside, a cricket sang. She ran her hand over the bandage on her arm. It had been a long time since someone had looked at her without wanting something. Since someone had reached out just to help. She lay down, pulled the blanket over her, and stared at the ceiling. "You are safe here." It echoed in her mind until sleep finally came. In the morning, the sun came through the window in soft gold light. Elara opened her eyes slowly. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. She stepped outside and found Jedidiah chopping wood behind the cabin. His shirt was off, muscles flexing with every swing. He looked up and nodded. "You sleep all right?" She nodded. "Better than I have in a while." "I made coffee," he said, and gestured toward the porch. "It's not much, but it is warm." They sat side by side on the steps, 2 tin cups between them. The mountains stretched out in front of them, blue and endless. Elara took a sip. "You live up here alone?" "Yeah. Been that way a while." "Why?" He shrugged. "Did a lot of things I did not like during the war. Came back, tried to start over. The land made more sense than people." She looked at him. "You do not seem like someone who hides." He smiled faintly. "I am not hiding. Just waiting on something worth coming back for." She looked away, cheeks warm. They spent the day quietly. He showed her how to gather water from the creek and how to check for mountain lion tracks. She helped him patch a section of the roof. By evening, they had fallen into a rhythm. That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was not heavy, it was the kind that felt easy. She looked at him. "Thank you?" "For everything." He met her eyes. "You do not owe me anything." "I know. But still." He leaned forward slightly. "You are not alone anymore, Elara." Her breath caught. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Jedidiah was already loading the small wagon by the time Elara stepped out of the cabin. The morning was brisk, the sky pale and cloudless. She hadn't expected to stay more than a night, but here she was, sleeves rolled, helping lift a sack of dried beans beside a man she barely knew and somehow trusted. "I thought you said you lived quiet," she said, brushing her hands on her skirt. Jedidiah tightened the rope over the supplies. "I do. But the roof at the schoolhouse needs fixing. The pastor asked if I'd haul up some timber and shingles." Elara raised an eyebrow. "That's a long way to go for someone else's roof." Jedidiah glanced at her, then adjusted the reins. "Not everything that matters is close by." She stood still a moment, then climbed up into the wagon seat beside him. He didn't question it. The trail down from the hills was narrow, the wheels rattling over hard-packed earth. Birds stirred in the trees. Elara watched the landscape slip by, the pine breaking into open country, wildflowers tangled along the fence lines. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, keeping her gaze ahead. "4 years since I left Missouri for good." She didn't ask why. He didn't offer. They reached the edge of Bridger's Hollow by midday. Jedidiah left the wagon near the church and walked with her toward the mercantile. Elara kept her shoulders back, chin high. The townsfolk watched, but no one dared speak. Inside the store, she picked up a spool of thread and a bundle of wool. Jedidiah waited by the door, arms crossed loosely. The storekeeper, an older woman with a crooked wrist and sharp eyes, leaned in. "You're staying up at Zane's place?" she asked quietly. Elara met her gaze. "I am." The woman eyed her a moment longer, then handed over the change. "Good man, that one. Keeps to himself, but he's steady." Elara gave a nod, then left without a word. Back at the wagon, Jedidiah handed her a biscuit wrapped in brown paper. "Figured you hadn't eaten." She took it without comment, and sat beside him again. As the wagon rolled through the center of town, a boy called out from the porch of the blacksmith's. "Hey, Mr. Zane, I saw a red fox near the creek last night." Jedidiah raised a hand. "Was it limping?" "No, sir. Fast as anything." He gave a small nod. "Then it wasn't the one I've been tracking." Elara turned to him. You been hunting it? Only watching. It's got a den somewhere near my fence line. Smart animal. She chewed slowly. You watch animals for fun? He smiled slightly. Sometimes they act better than folks. She looked away, but her mouth curved. They reached the schoolhouse just past the cemetery. Jedidiah unloaded the wagon, stacking the bundles near the steps. A woman with ink-stained fingers and a streak of gray in her braids stepped out. Jedidiah. Thank you. She noticed Elara and offered a polite nod. You're welcome to stay for supper if you're not in a hurry. Jedidiah glanced at Elara. We're not. They ate on the porch salt pork, beans, and cornbread. The teacher spoke of the children she taught, how one had brought her a frog in his lunch pail that morning. Jedidiah listened quietly, while Elara asked questions, her voice softer than it had been in town. When the sun fell low, they rode back in silence, the trail lit gold through the trees. Halfway up the hill, the wheel caught on a root. Jedidiah stepped down, pulled at the axle, and freed it with a grunt. Elara watched him, the way he moved steady and sure, not in a hurry but never unsure. She hadn't seen many men like that. Back at the cabin, he unhitched the horse while she carried in the wool. Inside, she knelt by the hearth and fed kindling into the embers. Jedidiah came in quietly, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood a moment, watching her. I've got an extra pine chest in the corner, he said. If you need somewhere to keep your things. She turned slightly. That'd be good. He nodded. A pause stretched between them. Then, you ever teach? He asked. I used to read to my son, she said quietly. He liked stories about rivers. Said he wanted to see one wide as the sky. Jedidiah's voice was gentle. You ever see one like that? She shook her head. No. But I like to believe he did. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the branches in slow rhythm. Jedidiah went to the shelf, poured 2 tin cups of boiled coffee, and handed her one. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. They sat near the hearth, not close, but not far. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this, she said. He stared into the flames. Me neither. She looked over at him, eyes tracing the lines time and dust had carved along his jaw, the quiet weight he carried without ever speaking of it. And something shifted in her chest, not sharp, not sudden. Just steady. I think I'll stay a while, she said. Jedidiah nodded once, slow and sure. I'd like that. The following week brought a stretch of high blue skies and dry wind that whispered through the lodgepole pines. Elara had begun rising each morning before first light, her hands already knowing the rhythm of the place. She filled the kettle, swept ash from the fireplace, and fed the hens Jedidiah kept behind the cabin. The birds had been skittish around her at first, but they'd grown used to her voice, just as she was growing used to the quiet steadiness of the hills. One morning, as she gathered eggs into a woven basket, Jedidiah approached from the tree line, his rifle slung over one shoulder and a brace of quail hanging from the other. You hunt often? She asked, shielding her eyes from the sun. Often enough to keep from buying meat, he replied, pausing to let the chickens settle before stepping closer. She set the basket down. You trap too? Sometimes. Got a line west of the creek. Mostly for fur, not food. He leaned the rifle against the porch railing and took the quail inside. Elara followed, wiping her hands on her skirt. You ever shoot? He asked over his shoulder. I know how to load a pistol. My husband taught me before he left for Abilene. She hesitated. Didn't come back. Jedidiah said nothing, just handed her a small knife and nodded toward the table. She began plucking feathers, the scent of pine smoke and raw meat thick in the air. That afternoon, Jedidiah saddled the horse and motioned for her to join him. Want to ride out to the old line shack? Storm last spring knocked part of the roof off. Figured I'd see how it held. She climbed up behind him, her arms more certain around his waist this time. They rode west into a valley of tall grass and yellow clover, the horses' hooves muffled beneath them. The trail narrowed near a stream, and Jedidiah dismounted to lead them across the slick stones while Elara stayed mounted, watching the water curl around his boots. At the shack, they found the roof half-caved and the door hanging loose from one hinge. Jedidiah stepped inside and ran a hand along the wall. "Used to bunk here when I was running cattle for old McLennan. Before I bought my place." Elara ducked in behind him. "You worked for someone else?" "Had to. My first 2 years out here, I didn't own much more than a bedroll and a cracked saddle." She touched the wall where someone had carved initials into the beam. "You ever think about leaving all this behind? Going back east?" He shook his head. "No place back there ever felt like mine." They sat in the grass afterward, the sun warm on their backs. Elara picked a sprig of yarrow and rolled it between her fingers. "I used to think I'd end up in Wichita. Maybe working at a boarding house. Safe, respectable. But I never could make myself stay." Jedidiah leaned back on his elbows. "You don't seem like someone who's meant to be kept indoors." She turned her head toward him. "And what do I seem like?" He studied her face a moment. "Like someone who's still figuring out where she fits. But you don't scare easy." Her laugh was low. "You didn't see me that night in the alley." "I saw enough." They rode back in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the wind through the trees said enough. When they reached the cabin, dusk was settling in. Jedidiah unsaddled the horse while Elara lit the lantern inside. Later, as they sat near the hearth, she pulled out the wool she'd bought. Her stitches were slow but even, a shawl taking shape beneath her fingers. Jedidiah watched her a moment, then picked up a small wooden box from the shelf and opened it to reveal hand-carved chess pieces. "You play?" he asked. She looked at the board, then back at him. "I know the pieces. My father taught me, but I haven't played in years." He set the board between them. "You'll remember." They played until the wood creaked beneath them from the weight of the fire, and the hour. She lost twice, but not without making him think. When she finally set her king down, she looked up. "You don't talk much about what you want." Jedidiah turned the box in his hands. "I want quiet that lasts. I want someone who won't walk out when things turn hard." She folded the shawl into her lap. "And if they don't walk out?" His eyes met hers. "Then I won't either." She reached across the board and closed the lid on the box. Her hand stayed there a moment longer than it needed to, and he didn't move his away. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the needles above the cabin. But inside, it was steady. A kind of hush that didn't ask for anything more than what was already there. And for the first time in all her wandering, Elara began to believe she had found something that could hold. The first frost came early that year. White clung to the grass just past dawn, and the edge of the creek held thin glassy ice that cracked under Elara's boots. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped into the lean to where Jedidiah kept the tools. He was there already, sleeves rolled, repairing a broken yoke with quiet focus. "You didn't say it was going to be this cold," she said, rubbing her hands together. He looked up, chewing on a piece of straw. "Didn't think it'd settle in so soon. We'll need more firewood before the week's out." She stepped closer and ran a hand over the new beam. "You always fix things yourself?" His nod was slow. "If I don't, no one else will." She glanced at the worktable. "You ever think about building more?" "A barn maybe, or a proper smokehouse." He set the yoke aside and leaned back against the wall. "I've thought on it. But I never had much reason to make more room." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a small handsaw and tapped the teeth with her thumb. "I could help," she said. "If you're thinking of it now." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, quiet, like the first warmth in spring ground. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Later that morning, they rode to a neighbor's claim 2 miles east. Jedidiah had promised to help dig out a fence post sunk too deep in last season's thaw. Elara rode beside him on a borrowed mule, the wind biting at her cheeks, the sun bright but offering little heat. The man who owned the land, George Merton, was older and slow with his hands, but he greeted them kindly. His daughter, a girl of maybe 14, brought out boiled potatoes and salt for their pockets. No mention was made of Elara being a guest at Jedidiah's place. The silence around it was polite, but not unkind. As Jedidiah worked the post free, Elara knelt beside the girl near the drying shed and helped sort beans from the husks. "You married to him?" the girl asked, not looking up. "No." The girl nodded, as if that was all the answer she needed. "He doesn't talk to most people. Just my pa. And now you." Elara smiled faintly. "He doesn't need to say much. He's clear when it counts." The girl thought on that a moment. "He brings us venison sometimes, when the winters are real bad." Elara paused, fingers stilling on the beans. "I didn't know that. He doesn't say it's from him." "But we know." By the time they rode back, the sun had dipped behind the hills. Jedidiah took the long way home, following a ridge that overlooked a narrow gorge colored copper and rust beneath the fall trees. Elara kept her eyes on the horizon. "You ever think about leaving the territory?" he asked suddenly. "No." His brows lifted slightly. "I left enough behind already," she said. "This place is rough, but it doesn't pretend to be more than it is. That counts for something." Jedidiah nodded. They reached the cabin just as the last light faded. Inside, she stirred stew while he lit the lantern and placed a hand-drawn map on the table. "What's that?" she asked, ladling broth into 2 bowls. "Parcel lines," he said. "I've been thinking of fencing off the northern edge. There's water there, and the soil's good." She brought the bowls over. "You mean to plant?" "In spring. Corn, maybe squash. Something to hold through next winter." They ate without hurry. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the eaves with dry needles. He finished first, then turned the map toward her. "You know anything about planting?" "A little. My father kept a plot behind our house. I remember more than I thought I would." He folded the map neatly. "Then we'll do it together." She rose to gather the bowls, but he caught her wrist not hard, just enough that she stopped. His hand was warm, rough at the palm, steady. "I mean that," he said. "It's not just talk." She set the bowls aside and looked at him, the firelight catching the lines around his eyes. "I know." They stayed like that a long moment, either pulling away. Then she stepped closer, and he didn't move. Outside, the cold deepened and the wind howled through the trees. But inside, the silence between them had shifted, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain. It had settled into something whole. Snow came down the day they finished the fence line. Jedidiah hammered the last rail into place as Elara steadied the post, her gloved hands red from cold and effort. The sky had gone pale and low, and the flakes drifted slow but steady, catching in her hair and melting against the wool of her shawl. The fence ran true along the northern edge of the clearing, marking the land that would hold their first rows of corn come spring. Jedidiah stepped back and looked down the line. "Good work," he said simply. Elara flexed her fingers and leaned her weight on the post. "It's straight. I didn't think we'd finish before the snow." "You kept pace." She raised an eyebrow. "I did more than keep pace." He gave a quiet nod of agreement, reaching into his coat for a strip of jerky. They stood there a moment, chewing in silence, watching the snow settle over the new posts. The land around them softened, edges fading under white. "I got a letter yesterday," she said after a while. Jedidiah looked over. "From a cousin in Kansas. She heard I was out here. Said she'd heard wrong things, that I ran off with a man I barely knew. He didn't say anything. I used to care what they thought," she went on. "I used to carry it around like a sack of stones. But when I read it, I didn't feel much of anything. Just glad I wasn't still there." Jedidiah brushed snow off his coat's sleeve. "It's not weakness, leaving behind what doesn't fit. I know that now." They walked back to the cabin slowly, boots crunching over new snow. Inside, the stove had kept the place warm. Jedidiah knelt to feed in more wood while Elara shook snow from her shawl and hung it near the door. She crossed to the table, pulled out the pie she'd baked that morning chokecherry, the last of their saved fruit, and began slicing. "You remember," she said, "when I first got here, I told you I didn't know why those men followed me into the alley?" Jedidiah stood and dusted off his hands. "I remember. I lied," she said, laying down the knife. "It wasn't just for turning down their drink. One of them had followed me before, back in Abilene. I saw his face in Bridger's Hollow and knew it'd start again." Jedidiah didn't interrupt. "I'd been running so long, I didn't know how to stop. Not until then. Not until you pulled me out of that alley." He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and set one hand on the edge of the table. "You don't owe me anything for that. I know. I'm not saying it because I feel I owe you. I'm saying it because I want you to know the truth." Jedidiah's gaze held hers. "You're not running anymore." "No," she said. "I'm not." They ate the pie warm, with mugs of tea steeped from dried spruce tips. Outside, the snow deepened, muffling the world. Afterward, they cleared the table together, their hands brushing now and then, either pulling away. As evening drew in, Jedidiah took a folded sheet of paper from the shelf. "I sent for the homestead papers," he said. "Wasn't sure I'd ever use them." Elara glanced up. "You helped mark the land," he said. "It's as much yours now as mine. I didn't do it for the land. I know. But I'd like to make it ours. If you want that." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I do." They stood there in the quiet, firelight dancing across the floorboards, and for the first time, no questions hung between them. Nothing uncertain. Nothing held back. Jedidiah reached to take her hand. "Then stay. Not just through the winter." She laced her fingers with his. "I'm not going anywhere." The snow fell soft and steady through the night. They sat by the fire, her head resting against his chest, his arm around her shoulder, both of them worn through and warm. Outside, the forest slept, and the fence line stood against the wind. They married in the spring. The preacher from Bridger's Hollow came up the hill with a Bible wrapped in oilskin and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Jedidiah wore a clean shirt and stood beside the fence they built, and Elara wore a dress she'd sewn from unbleached muslin, her hair braided with dried clover for luck. There were no guests beyond the Mertons and the schoolteacher who brought a loaf of honey bread tied in twine. But the vows were spoken clear, and the air smelled of soft earth and thaw. That summer, they planted the field together. The corn grew tall by mid-July, and squash crept along the base of the fence. Elara kept a ledger of what they canned beans, late berries, pickled carrots, and Jedidiah built her a root cellar beneath the slope nearest the coop. She taught reading to 3 neighbor children from the porch in the afternoons, and Jedidiah started carving furniture from spruce and pine, hands always busy, always shaping. Their nights were quiet, full of soft laughter, shared stories, and the warmth of a bed made for 2. By the time the leaves turned again, the cabin had a new winger room with a south-facing window and shelves full of books passed down from Elara's father, sent by her cousin with a short note and no trace of judgment. One evening before the frost, Jedidiah stood at the edge of the field, watching the last of the sun slip behind the hills. Elara joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You still think the land makes more sense than people?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "Now I think it's the people who make the land worth staying for." They stayed there until the stars came out, the sky wide and deep above them, and the fields full of the life they built together.